back then, too, in the 70s, they were hiring, Silicon Valley was hiring all the music majors, because when you think about it, music writing and thinking is very similar to programming. It's an abstract language.
Welcome back to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and I appreciate so much you tuning in. And visit our site at contrabassconversations.com for all the details about what we're doing here. And I would love to hear from you. Tell me your story. I love stories. And you can reach out and get in touch with me by emailing feedback@contrabassconversations.com. And you're going to love today's episode featuring Shinji Eshima. Now, Shinji is a longtime member of the San Francisco Opera and Ballet Orchestras, and he's an active composer as well. In fact, his ballet, Raku, has joined the repertory of both the San Francisco Ballet and the Joffrey Ballet companies. He also has written Swimmer, a recent ballet that is premiered by San Francisco as well. And he's also a well-known composer for the double bass. In fact, we'll open with an excerpt of his piece, If It's Tuesday, It Must Be Upbow, performed by Patrick Naher. And Shinji and I talk about this piece. We talk about writing for that ballet, studying with David Walter, advice for students, how to play in an opera orchestra, and so much more. I know you're going to love this interview. And after the interview, we'll feature a short excerpt from the San Francisco Ballet performing Raku. And you can find links to all of this in the show notes for this episode. I'd also like to take a moment and thank our sponsor, D'Addario Strings, and let you know a little bit about their Zyx strings, which are synthetic core strings that produce a rich, warm sound. And they're made with a new generation of synthetic material. They're very stable, incredibly stable under all sorts of climactic conditions. And they settle in on the instrument in just a few hours, and they provide a rich, gut-like, complex tone combined with clarity and power for bowing and for pizzicato. And they're developed primarily to offer outstanding pizzicato attacks and sustain, as well as superb bowing response. So get the sound, get the feel of gut strings with more evenness, more projection, more stability than real gut. Be sure to check them out, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast, D'Addario. All right, here we go with our episode featuring Shinji Eshima.
What was your first musical instrument?
It was actually the piano.
Okay.
Yeah, I was studying from about the age of 8 or so. And I had a really bad experience.
Really?
I won a young artist competition on piano.
Uh-huh.
And for that, I had to give a recital or play on a performance.
Yeah.
And I had a horrible memory lapse. It was at the Berkeley Piano Club across the bay where I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to the keyboard and I thought, 88 keys, which one do I press first?
Oh, no.
So it's kind of a typical story for a lot of bass players. They sort of end up there as a result of some kind of experience, or it's the only instrument left in the orchestra that they have a need for. And that was mine.
That was.
Yeah, I gave up the piano because of that terror. And I thought the bass would be kind of easy because you only have to deal with, one staff line.
Sure.
And when I went to the orchestra, they didn't have a need for a piano anyway, but they did have a need for a bass. So they gave me a bass and a ballet book, and that's how I started.
Were you studying with anybody, or were you just kind of fending for yourself?
There's a school in Berkeley called the Crowden School.
Mm-hmm.
Anne Crowden was the founder. She's a violinist. It's a string based school.
Yeah.
John Adams is one of the board members there, composer. And she had a bunch of very attractive students,
Okay.
classmates of mine in high school, and they needed a bass player. And so I was self-taught, very highly motivated to join this group.
Sure.
And I was taught by Anne, a violinist of all things. That was my first introduction to string playing. And I was fascinated anyway because it was neat to be able to play crescendo,
Yeah.
on one note.
Yeah, that's something you don't get with piano. You sort of forget that.
It's actually kind of cool. So that intrigued me. But no, I was self-taught and played with them in these Junior Bach Festival, little Brandenburg performances. And that was really how I began. I remember one performance afterwards, one of the audience members came back just to say, well done and all kinds of stuff. And he came up to me and he said, wow, you're a really good bass player. You must study with Charles Ciani. And I had no idea who that was. So when I got into approaching college, I looked him up.
Yeah.
And he became sort of my first real teacher, but it was totally by chance. It was because some random person in the audience said, oh, you must study with this guy. And I said, okay, I guess I should go figure out who it is.
Good chance encounter.
Totally random.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You went to Stanford,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
What'd you study at Stanford?
I wanted to become an electrical engineer, but when I went there was one elective in 4 years, so I thought, gee, this is kind of rough. And so I was doing music as well.
Oh.
And that ended up being my major, and I finished in 3 years. And I studied with Charles Ciani there. He was on faculty there, but he didn't actually teach there. He was at the San Francisco Conservatory.
Okay.
So I would have to commute up from Stanford to study with him weekly up here in San Francisco. And he also taught at SF State. And I now teach at both the conservatory and at SF State, so I've kind of followed in his footsteps. But for a long time, he was the major teacher in the area.
Yeah.
In fact, everybody in the ballet were students of his, and we all play in the opera together as well. He was the first principal bass of the opera when we split off from the symphony in 1980.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, and his legacy goes all the way back to Torello in Philadelphia. So there's another direct bass lineage there.
It's got to be interesting taking over from the person that you studied with and teaching at the same schools. Have you ever and I that happens more often than someone might think. Actually, have you ever discovered upon like old Ciani books or fingerings in some old filing cabinet or anything like that?
Well, his character and personality are legendary.
Yeah.
I mean, they're still talked about virtually daily, as if he hadn't actually passed away, which has been a while now, since the early 90s. Sure, it's a legacy that I appreciate, and I certainly find myself sometimes with similar, shall we say, feelings about students occasionally. And so my empathy and understanding for what he went through is heightened as I get older.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
What you ended up going to Juilliard? How did you discover David Walter? What drew you to that place besides just obviously it's Juilliard, the name?
Well, these same violinists, these girls that I knew in Berkeley, and they're still really close friends of mine. One of whom is actually Doris Fukawa, who became the director of the Crowden School now in Berkeley. Mm-hmm. And another friend of mine was at Stanford. And they sort of encouraged me to go to summer programs. Mm-hmm. And I went to the Music Academy of the West. Yeah. I just saw a flyer on the wall. And that was one introduction. I studied with Peter Mercurio when I was there. And then prior to going there, there was an LA bass club down in San Diego. And I had nothing to lose, so I thought to explore it. And I went down there and I heard a whole bunch of people give master classes. David was one of them. Murray Grodner was there, Abe Luboff, all these kind of LA people. And I didn't really know anything at the time, frankly.
Yeah.
And David taught at Juilliard. And I thought, well, there's a name I sort of recognize. And at the summer program at the Music Academy, I met a very influential musician to me, a violinist. And she was a student at Juilliard, and she kind of taught me everything I know about music. And I followed her to New York.
The contrast, I've only been out in the Bay Area for a few months now, but there's a certain vibe and lifestyle out here. And then finding yourself in Manhattan at that, what must be the old building at the, what was that experience like? Just going from.
Well, I'm not that old. So Juilliard was already taken.
It was at okay.
It wasn't at the old Manhattan school, and yeah, I had a terrible introduction to New York.
Yeah.
I kind of blew everything that I had on drinking scotch.
Okay.
And it was not nice, but I managed to get into Juilliard.
Yeah.
Which was kind of bizarre, you know. I kind of didn't think anything of it, but I didn't have enough money to get back home, so I ended up staying and going to school there. I'm glad I did.
Right.
But it's completely arbitrary the way this whole life has sort of evolved. It wasn't intentional. But I don't have any regrets.
Yeah. It's funny how that works so
It
frequently
is,
for
yeah,
people.
yeah. It's not by design, I think. And as you go through life, I think so many things are that way. You don't, it's hard to plan these things.
One of the lyric opera bass players, Greg Sarche, went to Juilliard and it was I interviewed him and he said, I said, what was your plan? He's like, no plan whatsoever. He ended up studying with Michael Morgan and in the Met, and Michael said he was Michael's only student. Michael hadn't had students for years there, and I think he didn't check any box on his Juilliard form, so they just put him with Michael. And he said, I'm going to teach you how to play in an opera orchestra, and you're only going to take opera orchestra jobs, auditions when they come along, but you'll get it. And he did, and it's funny how that works.
Yeah, it's a different repertoire too.
Yeah.
It's a different skill set, really. But
it is, yeah.
It's a little particular. Yeah.
Well, what and I'd love to dig into that. But maybe just if you get any general impressions of David Walter as a teacher, or any takeaways. It's kind of a broad topic, but when you think of him, what are the first things that come to mind?
Well, I mentioned earlier that I drank a lot of scotch when I was there at a particular bar, Aristotle's. And so it was kind of amusing to me to go to my first lesson, and from a drawer, he pulls out a bottle of scotch.
Oh, okay.
But for him, it wasn't to drink, it was to clean your strings.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So he would offer to clean your strings if your bow stuck or something like that. He was a musician's musician, really.
Yeah.
His manner of teaching was more inspirational and more to open up your mind. So you would invite a certain sound, I think, and pleasure from playing, from participating. His favorite line was always to quote Pablo Casals, to say Casals' favorite English word was variety.
Oh.
So he would always want you to incorporate that in however you played. He loved to be the bass student as editor of music, so anything written was just a suggestion, and you were always free to change or adapt as you saw fit. And I wrote one piece early on as a tribute to David called "If It's Tuesday, It Must Be Upbow," because at one point I was playing, I forgot what it was, but I went up to him and asked him, so is this up bow or down bow? And his reply was, well, what day is it? And yeah, the lesson learned from that is, on any given day, it's down bow or up bow, and you have to be able to do either. That has left a kind of a lasting impression.
Yeah.
This openness, it's certainly along the lines of how I teach. Sometimes it's only because I don't know.
Sure.
It's a convenient answer to give. Well, what day is it? And there was another attitude thing. When I was taking my first jury, I was helping a friend of mine move in the middle of the night. And somehow or another, we got in an accident as I was cleaning something, and I cut my finger open.
Ugh.
And so badly enough, it required a stitch. So in New York, in the middle of the night, I think it was Roosevelt Hospital near Juilliard, and I remember the patient next to me was bleeding from a gunshot wound, and I think that person actually died. So, and I was playing one of David's basses. I was borrowing one of his at school. It was actually the bass that I think Ballet used. One of these. It was a beautiful little bass. And when I called him up to tell him on the morning of my jury, the first jury in front of everybody, I told him what had happened, and my thumb was actually bleeding right on my callus to go into thumb position. And all he said was, "Don't bleed on the bass," which is in the old adage, "The show must go on." And that was also an important lesson, and I use that all the time now with other students who feel like they're going to cop out or look for an excuse not to do something that requires them to sort of toughen up. Yeah.
That'd be a good T-shirt slogan. Don't bleed on the bass.
Yeah, it is. That's all he was concerned about. I mean, you still have to play. And I remember thinking there's this groove in my thumb right on where I cut it right on my callus, and I could literally pits by pulling my thumb sideways because it held the groove. But so I actually was practicing that morning and playing hard on my thumb so I wouldn't feel it, but then noticed that I was in a groove. I could slide all the way up and down the string without slipping off the side.
In a way, it's almost an advantage if you can handle the pain.
Yeah, there's the new technique book on slicing your thumb so that you don't fall off the G string.
I know that David Walter composed, and I'm curious, is that around the same time you started composing, or had you been doing that earlier? When did that come about for you?
Well, I was noodling around on the piano when I was a kid. A lot of repetitive stuff, and I remember my father just sort of complaining, that sounds like too repetitive, so I sort of gave that up at the time, and came back to it later in life after I'd sort of gotten the job here. Yeah, I needed a piano to hear harmony and stuff, so I didn't have my own until I got the gig in 1980. So I didn't really start seriously writing until then, but I guess that's ancient history already, isn't it?
Well, so the piano, you work at the piano typically?
Yeah, I'm really old-fashioned.
Do you?
Pencil and paper.
Really? Okay. Okay. Great.
I started the piano. Well, I transferred to a computer to print it out and to hear different voices, scenes, and things like that. But no, everything starts at the piano.
Is it ever a surprise for you? I mean, you're hearing those harmonies and just sitting at the piano and writing it out. But is it ever a surprise for you getting into the computer? Do you adjust things once they get into the computer, or?
Yeah. I mean, a computer is just a really convenient tool. It's a massive multi-track recorder, basically.
Yeah.
I remember before I had one, and there was a tape deck that came out, a cassette deck, with a separate mic input for each channel, so I could actually record something and then do a different pass. And I thought that was just like the greatest.
Yeah, I know. It was the greatest thing. It's just amazing how rapidly this technology has accelerated. Now you can do that on your phone.
When I was at Stanford, I worked. I took classes at the Artificial Intelligence Lab, which is where they had the computer-generated music program started. And they had back then, this is like in the 70s, mid-70s, the first ever sampler. And the sampler was as large as this room we're in now. It's about as big as a closet. And it would only do something like 5 seconds.
Wow.
And now an iPhone is 10 million times more powerful than what we were using. But I remember even back then trying to work on a bass sound.
Oh, really?
And I wasn't smart enough really to know the math behind it. I just sort of go by ear and try and get something. But it was a fun time. The lab back then was way in the hills behind the campus. And there'd be little robotic things kind of roaming the hills, as people were experimenting with different things. But they gave that time, like 5 or 6 in the morning, to the musicians to use the computer time then because nobody else was using it.
Wow, that must have been such a fascinating time in hindsight. Just looking back at like in the 70s, there's just so much going. I mean, that's not too many miles away from where Apple computer was taking off.
I have a classmate of mine who essentially retired by working at Apple. He was a composition student. But back then, too, in the 70s, they were hiring, Silicon Valley was hiring all the music majors. Because when you think about it, music writing and thinking is very similar to programming. It's an abstract language. It makes sense. There are phrases and patterns and sort of logical steps to follow. And in some ways of my class, I'm like, a failure because I got a job in music. All of my friends, they're all retired now, having gone off into Silicon Valley and made their fortunes. But it was an interesting time. Chowning was there, and he developed the first FM synthesis, which became the Yamaha DX7, which was sort of the first commercial-grade synthesizer that everybody was using back then. And he made some money off of that, I remember. And also, Leland Smith created the first computer printing program, music printing, called Score.
Score? Wow.
Yeah, way back then. And a friend of mine, actually a classmate of mine, Heinrich Taube, who is now head of composition at University of Illinois, he wrote a piece for me, and we used Score back then. I mean, we had to use these enormous computer things, screens, and it became amongst, if not the first piece printed using this kind of technology. It was kind of cool. It's called Nocturne.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's published by Frank Proto, who was also a Dave Walter student who created Leiden.
Yeah. I'm actually talking to Frank in a few days.
Oh,
I haven't
you have to say hi.
I absolutely will.
Yeah,
I absolutely will.
He's awesome.
Yeah. Wow. What approximately what year was that piece came out and Score and everything? Like, when, do you remember?
Well, we wrote the piece, I think, in 77.
Okay. Oh, wow.
Yeah. On a computer. And then Frank started his company, like, probably around then. Because Rick and I went to go visit him at his house in Cincinnati. And back then, yes, Frank had the first to have one of these Fairlight systems, and synthesizers that also did printing. He was really on top of the scene. He always is. But I remember him when he came to Juilliard to go to master class as one of Dave's students. And it was actually, when I think about a beautiful piece of irony that, or full circle, that he surprised me when he came to be the guest at a local bass bash. He played that piece that I wrote for David, If It's Tuesday Must Be Up.
Oh, really?
For the whole group, yeah.
Oh, that's great.
That's awesome.
So your first piece, was bass the instrument you were mainly writing for your first pieces, like bass, or what were you writing for?
Friends. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Whoever was around.
Yeah.
I had a friend who played harp and oboe and violin. Yeah. Just whoever would play it.
When did I'm fascinated. I really want to talk about like the opera and just like get into it. But maybe before that, when did you start to expand out? I mean, now you've written ballets. that workflow must be completely different. When did that start? When did you start to write for larger scale groups?
Well, again, it's totally by chance.
Yeah.
The first time I ever wrote anything was for a class at Stanford
Mm-hmm.
for full orchestra, and it was just an exercise in orchestrating a piece of Brahms, Opus 118, and nothing ever happened. I mean, I wrote little chamber music stuff, and then Yuri Posakov, a choreographer in residence at San Francisco Ballet, had a story in mind that was based on a Japanese monk
Mm-hmm.
who burned down the temple in Kyoto. And he was looking for a composer for this ballet. Literally, I mean, we have one friend in common. I knew him only really as a dancer, but he kind of looked into the pit and said, well, he looks kind of Japanese, and figured that I was know something about that, and asked if I would write a score.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And I was scared out of my mind, and it was bizarre, really. And so, but I couldn't say no, because what he was offering was, can you write for full orchestra to premiere here at San Francisco Ballet in the Opera House with the #1 dancer in the world? You know, Juan Montan, and also Pascal Molat and Damien Smith. And so it's to go from 0 to 10,000 miles an hour in a second.
Right.
It really was that. It's a break of a lifetime.
Yeah.
But it was terrifying. And I had 3 months to do it.
And you had 3 months. I was curious how much time. So, what do those 3 months look like?
Well, I had already planned to go on a sailing trip to Greece.
Okay.
I found out about this in June, and the trip was in July. And I have a horrible fear of sailing, frankly. But the fear of writing a piece for full orchestra for the first time, especially for all my colleagues who are going to judge this.
Yeah.
In one sense, it's my ultimate dream, sure, but it was also the scariest thing. And so I went on the sailing trip with one friend and again, 6 gorgeous models. As it turns out, it was so bizarre. And I went, and my thought was, well, if I drown in the Greek islands, at least I won't have to write this score. I'll have an excuse, right? And I just came to that because we were in some storms. I accepted the trip thinking that I was going to be on board the ship that was going to be commanded by others.
Mm-hmm.
But we get there, and my friend is there, and he says, well, you have to navigate this thing.
Oh, no.
And I hadn't actually ever been on a sailing boat of that size before. And I guess I must look like I know technology or something, because I was handed, just like the bass, the manual and the instrument, and had to figure out how to navigate from Athens to about 8 different islands. And I did. And we somehow survived, but there was one day when I thought we were just going to go overboard because we went right into a storm. And I thought, well, this is it. But I was sort of relieved that I wouldn't have to write this piece.
But you survived.
Yeah. So, I mean, in some ways you do something that's scarier, and then you think suddenly that, well, then it's not so bad to write a piece. It's weird, but that's literally the way it happened.
Did you approach that? And I'm always curious. I do a little bit of composition and a little bit of arrangement. I'd love to know. Do you write? You said you write at the piano. Is the orchestration as you're writing coming to you throughout the process, or is it kind of like 2 separate steps for you?
I hear things,
Yeah.
sure. and I don't mean that like in the movie sense, but after working in the pit now for over, gosh, this is 37 years now, playing every composer you can think of, and hearing all of my colleagues play, I hear the registers in my head. I mean, I know the color that they can sound like, and orchestration-wise too, I'm right in the thick of it, in the middle of it, and then you hear all these different conductors come in and highlight what they want to bring out, and you can listen for that. And yeah, it's in some ways it's like the greatest teacher you can imagine. And then also I had the luxury of being able to ask all my colleagues, well, and I always start with, what's your favorite note to play? Where's your comfort zone? What do you like to play? And because I think of that for myself, what is the most enjoyable register, thing that makes the instrument sound its best? I'm not particularly one for extended technique because I find that painful myself. But how to utilize the instrument to where the player enjoys playing it. That's kind of one thing that motivates me. But yeah, I do hear the sound when I'm playing, when I'm composing.
Yeah. That's a great question to ask, for a composer to ask. What do you like to play? I wonder how common that question is. Because I think about that when I play a new work. I think there's something about this. I like this. It feels good.
Yeah. Well, they're also, all my friends are getting wise to me now. So look out when he comes and asks, what's possible to play or what you enjoy playing. Because I put it all into the one bassoon solo that's notable in this ballet called Raku, and Rufus Olivier is the principal. We play during the intermissions in poker, and so I think of the highest compliment was during the first reading rehearsal of the piece. He played this very extended bassoon solo, and as it turns out, it isn't easy to play, but it covers the entire range of the bassoon. And his colleagues near him said, after he played it, read through it the first time, they told him and suggested that he should have let me win at poker. I still think of that as like the highest compliment, to get that from your colleagues, especially those you play poker with. And that makes life meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of a story of there was this recent John Adams commission at the Lyric Opera, and this I forget the names escape me right now.
Well, John's son is Sam is a bass student, bass player, and composer now, is easily assuming the mantle, significant composer in the world, and he actually was a student at the Crowd School.
Yeah, really? Yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, it started, and he gave a talk recently that I attended, and I was floored because he had to play the same piece and made note of it that struck me when I was trying to learn how to play the bass. Also with Anne, that's playing Brandenburg Sixth. And because that's for the first time in the middle slow movement, the bass line is independent of the cello. And for somebody who doesn't know what they're doing, that was terrifying.
Oh, bad. Yeah.
Because every piece prior to that, all I had to do was follow the cello, right? And play the same pitch. And I was playing with just basically one finger at the time and following along. And I'll never forget that first rehearsal. The cello starts and it's double the time that the bass is playing. And it didn't sync. And all of a sudden, the bass line was independent. And I felt, completely naked. and Sam was bringing up the same piece, saying that was an experience for him to learn too.
Yeah, the training wheels come off when the cello takes their own line.
Yeah. But I think it's, in retrospect, as a composer, it's like the best thing that you could do is study the bass line.
Yeah.
It gives you everything. It gives you all the harmony, the direction, the line, the rhythm, timing. It's really, I think.
I wonder if that's why it seems to me, and it could be just because I interview bass players, but I don't think so. I think the percentage of bass players who also compose is higher than some other instruments, and
Mhm.
I've always wondered why that is, and that could be a reason, or you're not playing as many notes, maybe you have more time to think of other ideas versus like first violin or something like that.
No, I think so. Sure.
Yeah.
I don't mean to shortchange the bass, but um, it isn't easy on the bass to give full voice to. I think to sometimes your desire for musical expression.
Yeah.
One can appreciate. I mean, I still think being a bass player, one of my favorite things to do is a perfectly placed single pizzicato, right? Like at the end of De Valkyrie or something.
Yeah.
Fire music. Or even in Puccini, when you hear the voice coming down, and then it's the pits actually that gives it the lift, the bounce, grammatical point that gives it its musicality. I mean, there's only one place to place that note when it's in a phrase, when you're hearing a singer. If it comes in too early or too late, or is out of tune, it completely screws up the whole line, right?
Yeah.
So it's so significant. And when it's right there, there's no better feeling. And that's what I love,
Yeah.
Playing bass. That part you can't duplicate. But it's not often that you have a singing melody,
Right.
I mean, just honestly. And to be able to do that in composition is very freeing. It's also, as an orchestral player, it's incredibly liberating to do whatever the heck you want.
Yeah.
And you can break all the rules. Like, if I want parallel this, I'll just write it. I think it sounds right here. So, in some ways, it's like thumbing my nose up at all those hours of study.
Yeah. Right. If you're free like that in the orchestra, you're not lasting long in that orchestra, probably.
Yeah. Yeah. No, right. Sure.
I'd love to hear about, and if a couple of people were telling me about but you auditioned right around the time that the symphony and the opera orchestra split. Is that right? Could you maybe just talk about that experience? And if I understand it right, you kind of had the choice of where you wanted to go or how it wanted. Maybe just talk about that audition and just that thought process.
Sure. I've been really lucky with auditioning, and to be able to have a job where I grew up was really kind of unheard of. But yeah, the orchestras were splitting. The symphony was splitting into both the symphony, San Francisco Symphony, and the opera, because they built a new symphony hall next door to the opera house here. So they needed two orchestras, and so I took the symphony audition first, and it was Ada de Vart, the conductor at the time, and I was offered a contract, but it was conditional. They didn't like my instrument. The instrument I had was the one that I bought actually from Berkeley High. It was my high school instrument.
Wow.
And but heck, it got me through Juilliard, got me through everything. Another audition playing in San Jose Symphony. And then subsequent to that, there was the opera audition, which I took. And in 1980, the opera and the symphony paid the same amount of money, only the opera in half as much time.
Yeah.
So, and they didn't have any condition. I didn't have to go buy an instrument. So I took the opera.
Yeah.
It was, at the time, a no-brainer.
That math works well if you do it right.
Well, it hasn't so much now. I've been lucky enough to play in the ballet as well. So the two combined, make a livable wage. And I'm glad I did, as it turns out, because of my ability to write ballets now and have that experience. It's a totally different repertoire.
Yeah.
But I really lucked out in being able to get a job that, people kind of denigrate them as pit jobs, but I actually really love it. I kind of find sometimes certain things missing in just symphonic concerts, whereas in the opera you have the singers and the sets, and it's a multimedia experience now.
Well, listening to the world's greatest singers just night in and night out has to have an effect on just your overall musicianship. I remember
Absolutely.
what the principal cello I think he's retired now, lyric opera, Daniel Morgenstern. I remember reading his technique book that he'd written about, and there was all these like lyrical concepts that I think just being around that kind of musicianship and that kind of flexibility and robot, it's gotta just rub off on your overall musicianship.
Absolutely, yeah. In my day, Gary Carr was like the soloist, right?
Yeah.
And he would always say he studied with singers. I think it was Jenny Terrell at the time. And it's no different now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in order for a phrase to sound natural, it has to breathe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can't just constantly exhale. And when you hear great singers, how they phrase, it influences you. You can't deny that. And the quality of sound. Your ear wants to hear it.
Yeah.
So it will choose that sound, even over a full orchestra, when a beautiful voice is there. I mean, I'll never forget Montserrat Caballé. It's just my favorite singer of all time, ever. And, you know, she weighed 300 pounds or plus, but I was totally in love. You know, there is just like the most amazingly beautiful, it's just, you can't imagine it, you know.
Yeah.
To hear her float, this come out of nowhere, this sound. And yeah, we've done many performances with her when she just bring the house down and people go nuts, and rightly so. And even though the orchestra can be playing for any other singer a million decibels too loud, the quality of her sound is something that your ear will focus on, so much so that you'll hear it. It's that beautiful. And that's special.
Yeah.
You know, you don't get that in everybody. Pavarotti's another sound that's so unique.
What as a spending all these years in an opera orchestra, what are some of the skills that are unique to playing in an ensemble like that versus like a symphony on the stage?
Yeah, well, I was taught very early by a violinist of, I forgot the name of his quartet, but anyway, his advice was always look at the conductor, but never follow him or her.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of true. Yeah, you have to play with your section, you have to play with the orchestra, but what's amazing, I think, about this orchestra is the ability to listen always for the singer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like no matter what the guy on the podium is doing, you go with that, and it's impossible to play wrong if you're listening.
Yeah.
You know, so much is given by the breath, the pickup, the tempo, a phrase, cadenzas. It's a natural language, right? It has its own organic timing.
Yeah.
And when it feels natural, then everybody feels like you could speak the same language. And that's what this orchestra does so well. And that's what I think good opera orchestras do, is constantly listening.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not the same every night, so it has to be flexible.
Yeah, probably much more so than the same symphony played 4 times in a row.
Yeah, and I've noticed that actually. Sometimes, you know, in the ballet orchestra, it's a little different when you want the same tempo all the time for these dancers.
Right.
That's a different thing, but it really is secondary to the singers, the soloists. When you want to support that, there are times when the orchestra can be full out, when the singer's not singing stuff, and that's also glorious. But basically, I think the talent is, or what's unique about the skill set is the need to be flexible and to be musical. Yeah. But that's where I think it's also great. It's because you feel like you're part of being musical. It's not just playing by rote or mechanically, or dialed in, as some people tend to do.
I was subbing for Rosencavalier a few years ago, and I don't remember exactly how long that is, but it's 4 hours plus, I think. And I remember just looking at that clock in the pit. It's like 7:30, 8:30, 9:30, 10, and your second intermission, and I'm on my second cup of coffee, and it's 11 p.m. or something like that. And I think that's something that people who don't play ballet might not realize. It's just like that those massive lengths of time that you have to be on and concentrating. How do you, this might be kind of a hard question, but how do you deal with focus over such an extended period of time? I mean, are you on for all 5 of those hours of those operas? How do you manage that?
It's kind of like the carrot at the end of the stick, especially you mentioned Rosenkavalier. Well, the last page is probably the most glorious music there is, the trio.
Yeah.
Right? And then when you understand what's actually going on, what Strauss as a composer was writing, this to actually give love this way, to rise above it, to know what's appropriate, and to have that trio play. That's what I mean about the carrot at the end of the stick. It's worth it.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth it. And sometimes to get to something that good, you have to go through a lot.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely nothing compared to doing The Ring, which is over 17 hours. Gotterdammerung, I always loved. You're playing for 45 minutes, which is longer than most Beethoven symphonies, right?
Right.
And you turn the page, and then it says, Act 1, Scene 1.
Right.
Yeah. And there's still another couple hours to go just in the first act. Or Dutchman is like 2 hours and 40 minutes in one act.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can't have your cup of coffee before you go into the pit, because you'll have to leave the pit earlier than 2 hours and 40 minutes.
Right.
You have to kind of plan it. You do have to plan your diet. You find a lot of musicians around here eating at weird times.
Yeah.
It does take a certain amount of stamina.
Yeah.
And effort and focus. Yeah. Everybody has their own technique on how to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the rewards are worth it.
Yeah.
It's great repertoire. I mean, playing Rosenkavalier as well, it's like playing Don Juan and Death and Transfiguration and Ein Heldenleben all in one night.
Right.
Sequentially. It's challenging repertoire.
Yeah.
And people, I don't think really, when you think of Verdi and kind of this sort of oompa type music, you don't really fully appreciate the difficulty of the repertoire in opera. I mean, Wagner is also really, really challenging. Always playable.
Yeah.
Everything is extraordinarily well written. But it's hard.
Right. Right.
It's physical.
Well, you must have to, especially when you're in the thick of the season and you've got it. Is the structure? Are you doing a different opera every night when you actually get into performing? What was the term for that, repertory? I forget what the yeah. I remember playing backstage at Lyric Traviata, but the other opera they were rotating through was Dr. Atomic.
Mm-hmm.
And above me, so I'm playing the oompa part, and above me is this giant atom bomb.
Right. Yeah.
Well, so when you're in the thick of it, managing your downtime must be just so crucial, and just having some time at home to be quiet and be still.
Yeah. Well, the hours of the opera and the ballet orchestra combined is about 150% of the symphony.
Mm-hmm.
Add to that teaching at the conservatory and at SF State, and then trying to compose a ballet at the same time is kind of crazy. But a lot of the ballet composition I used to do here underneath the pit in the upper house, because after I get done from work, it was quiet time, there's a piano there. And so, frankly, it was a really great place to do it. So
yeah,
I kind of did feel like a fan of the opera house, because nobody else was here, but I'd be banging away on this piano trying to write some notes. It takes its time, and it is taxing. And so, frankly, this year is the first time I'm taking a year's leave of absence from teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got the principal here, Joe Lesher, to take over for me. This happened just a few days ago, actually, at State. And now that Scott Pingle is back from Michigan, so I really want to write more.
Yeah.
I've been teaching for over 30 years, and it's been great.
Mm-hmm.
I love it. But as I'm finding more satisfaction out of writing.
Yeah.
I want to have time to do that. So I'm finding out later in life, maybe too late, but time is time, and if you want it, you have to kind of make it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I've got one more question that I like to ask people, and you've done so many things in the world of music, and if you could go back and give your 20-year-old self some advice, what would it be? What might you say?
Well, I've been telling my students this lately, and it took a whole career to come around to this. If we're talking about bass in particular, if you want to get a job, and I think there's nothing really better than playing in an orchestra because it's fantastic. Is to really get to know excerpts and to learn to think of them as music. It's not an etude or something boring to study. There's an approach and a way to appreciate playing them. You know, playing Beethoven sounds different than Brahms, sounds different than Strauss, and start the Mozart excerpts as soon as you can.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
I know, give me a hard time about Marriage of Figaro, but I mean, to get that fourth finger articulate and as strong, so that it's not a trill, but it's intentional, and it sounds clear and clean at any tempo that you need. I remember at my audition, I had a playoff with another candidate, and that was the excerpt, and the screen came down, and you had to play for the conductor directly, and I had a stare down with him. I wasn't going to let anything get in my way, so I played it at a wicked tempo from memory, and look, even though the music's in front of you, and just stared at him the entire time. I didn't want to miss 1 millimeter of that stick. And you have to go into this business now, especially now, with the confidence that you are the best player ever to exist. Because the job market out there is so treacherous, and you have to be, way more prepared. But if you love it, then you have to. That's the work that's required. And I've known a lot of kids who come through and can play fantastic solos, and Bottesini to make your ears, just completely twinkle and spin. But if I ask them to play the recitative from Beethoven Ninth, it's just like clueless.
Yeah.
And they could play solo Bach beautifully at pitch, but if you ask them to play in the lower registers, everything is out of tune. And I just don't. If you want a job, if you want something other than that, if you're doing it to become a soloist, although I don't know,
right.
There's room for Edgar.
Yeah.
And that's about it in the world. I don't think you're being realistic, and I don't think it's so often discounted as really not being real music. But I go back to that, knowing when to play one single pizzicato perfectly is cool.
Yeah.
And it's where so much of bass is at.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to fully appreciate that and playing with I used to row crew in high school, and you have 8 guys in a shell, and the feeling of that power is the closest thing to being flying, I think. And it's similar in a section when everybody's flying together. And somebody that I hope you interview is John Feeney. Do you know him?
I know that name. I haven't talked to him, but I would love to. He's on my list. I would love to talk to him.
He's like the consummate bass player, and he fights for bass in a wonderful manner. He was my classmate, and I just admired him, to the ends of the earth. It was just physical, intuitive playing. It was this pride. Every note mattered.
Wow.
And you talk about it, you discuss it, and you play it, and practice it. It's the most important thing to do.
Yeah.
That's the attitude. And he's right. It really is. In that way. It's just like rowing crew. if one person, catches the clam, as I used to call it, everything falls apart. But when it's together, when it's flying,
Yeah.
it's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's what, to me, it's all about.
That's a great image. I love that.
Yeah, it's similar.
Yeah. Shinji, pleasure.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks again, Shinji, for chatting with me. So great to talk to you. And folks, check out the show notes for links to everything that Shinji's up to. We got some news and some housekeeping and some listener feedback. And I'd like to start by just thanking so much. Thank you to Andrew Hitz from The Entrepreneurial Musician for having me on his podcast. And also thank you to Hugh Sung for having me on A Musical Life. I was on both of these podcasts recently and so honored to be on both of these shows. I talk about similar things, but they're very different hosts, very different shows. And so they're different conversations. And so if you'd like to learn a little bit about me and my journey and that kind of thing, those two shows are great to check out, and I'll put links to those in the show notes. So again, thank you, Hugh. Thank you, Andrew. So thrilled to be on both of those shows. I've also got several bits of listener feedback, so thank you again for writing in. And if you ever want to get in touch, feedback@contrabassconversations.com is great, or hit me up on social media, leave me a message. I respond to everything. I'll put your message on the show happily. That's what I love to do. This is a community show. This is for the double bass community. So reach out and get in touch, and I'd love to share what you've got going on. So I got a message from Paula recently who says, love the podcast. It's very helpful. I played contrabass in high school. It was not a productive experience. And sorry about that, Paula. I just went back to playing the instrument recently, and I found a teacher. If I can play in a community college jazz ensemble, I will consider myself a success. So Paula says, I work full-time as a nurse. How many hours a day do I need to practice to enter into a community college jazz ensemble within a 3 to 5 period? So what I said is, thank you for listening to the podcast, Paula. It's great that you're getting back into playing bass. And my recommendation was really start off with an hour a day and shoot for 5 days a week. If you can get 6 days a week or 7 days a week, that's great. But an hour a day goal 5 times a week is a pretty achievable goal. It's hard if you have a full-time job. You don't want to shoot for 3 hours every day and then not meet your goal and then be discouraged. And I think consistency is just like working out or anything. Even if you only got 20 or 30 minutes free on a particular day, you can at least do some fundamentals and make some progress. So that was my advice to Paula. And if anyone else has anything else or wants to say hi to her, get in touch and let me know. Ray Parker wrote in. He says, I love the podcasts. I only became aware of them over the last year or so, but I've been listening to everything coming out and love them. Keep up the good work. Thank you, Ray. It's great. Ray's up to all sorts of interesting things. RayParkerBassPlayer.com is his website. That'll be in the show notes too. And thanks for writing in, Ray. Matthew Corey wrote in and just had a beautiful message. I won't share the entire message, but he talks about starting to play double bass during his time at the University of New Mexico and getting his doctorate from UCLA, studying with Chris. And he just really identified with kind of the message of this show and what I write on the blog, and talked a lot about Bach. And he said his relationship with Bach continues to grow every single day. And that resonated with me. I thought that was a beautiful sentiment. So thanks again, Matt, for writing in. Ira Gold also wrote in. You probably know Ira from the podcast. If not, definitely check him out. He's a favorite guest, one of the National Symphony bassists, and teaches at Peabody. And Ira is getting involved at mockauditions.com. And I will include a link in the show notes. But what it is right now, and I'll give you more details later, but you can participate in a series of 2 mock auditions and get video feedback back from Ira, which is very cool. Again, I'll have a link in the show notes, so be sure to check that out. And that's a very cool development, Ira. So super exciting. That's awesome. Tracy wrote in, who's an old colleague of mine, actually from the Civic Orchestra of Chicago, Tracy Friedlander, and she is getting ready to launch a podcast and had some wonderful things to say about contrabass conversation. So thank you, Tracy. And so Tracy and I are actually going to be talking, and I think she's going to be on my podcast and I'm going to be on her podcast. And I just love seeing new projects from people. She's doing something kind of in that music entrepreneur space that is so helpful to people these days. And I'll give you more info about Tracy's project when we talk. And again, I'll just say it again, folks, if you're doing something like Tracy, if you're starting a new show or a new blog or anything like that, let me know. I'd love to spread the word. That's what I'm here for. And Max also wrote in. He says, "You rock, dude. Keep it up." Thank you, Max. The quality of the podcast is really consistently over the top in terms of guests, content discussed, and the recording quality. Thank you for hitting it hard. That's awesome, Max. Thank you. That I love to hear feedback like that. And he says, "I listen to it all the time while making farm deliveries through the Adirondack Mountains. I'm 26 and have been playing just over 2 years. Finding your voice has really been indispensably helpful in accelerating my understanding as well as inspiration for the instrument." And that is so cool. Then he tells me more about his background. I won't share all of that right now, but I just love that image of Max listening, delivering farm equipment in the Adirondacks, listening to podcasts. That's what this medium is all about for me. It's just so cool that people can be out there all over the world and sharing this community. Shinji and Frank Proto, like we did earlier, and all these guests that we've had and that we have coming up. That's super exciting. I find that very inspiring, and I just love hearing from folks. So thank you so much. I have a lot of other listener feedback to share, but I will do that on another episode. So we're going to draw this episode to a close. So thank you so much for tuning in, following along with me and with Shinji, Frank Proto from the last episode, all the guests we've had, all the people we have coming up. The bass community is such an exciting place. There's so much going on, and I am thrilled and honored and humbled to have the position that I do, bringing this content to you each and every week. And I'd like to thank, please go visit them. D'Addario, thank you so much for sponsoring the show. What I'm doing long-term it's so critical to have folks like D'Addario on board helping me with this project, and I appreciate it so much. So be sure to check them out online. And folks, I appreciate each and every one of you listening to this episode. And if you found this helpful, share it with somebody. Forward it send them an email, Facebook, Twitter, whatever. Spread the word. I guarantee you there's at least one bass player that you know that hasn't heard this show at all. Even though we've got a good listenership, I still know only a small percentage of the bass world listens to the show or has even ever listened to one of these podcasts. So please, if you enjoy what's going on here, the most helpful thing you can do is just share this with someone that you think would get something out of it. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will be back soon for more life in the low end of the spectrum.